So for those watching the recording, just know that I just started recording. You only missed a little bit of us just chit-chatting. Um, I was telling a colleague how I was excited for this class, and she asked what it was on, and I said it's like personality and language, and she said that's very niche, very specialized, and it is. It's a very specific type of research and a specific topic. And you would take a class like psycholinguistics and get maybe this would be discussed like microscopically within a larger topic like this. So this is that tiny sentence that was probably in a psycholinguistics book now taught as an entire class. And this is really where my research is. So I'm pumped about it. And in a different life, I probably would have had a PhD in psychology instead. So so this is getting to marry my two favorite worlds together. What I want to do, okay, I'm going to share a PowerPoint, share screen. Let me get this set up real quick.
Will your research include amnivert people like myself, or will you continue the trend of having only
Don't
extroverts
even go.
introverted?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the book we're going to use through this class in a second. You don't have it yet. You don't need to buy anything. It's one I'm actively writing as I'm teaching this class. So you get the sneak peek. It actually already has a contract too with University of Michigan Press. It's due in July. So this class was the like, oh, you have to start writing it now class. I have a section where I discuss that and its connection to personality theory, what it actually means. Yes, I told my mentor, Dr. Tardo, who I think you all know, that I just like I need to add a section on what it means to be an ambivert. And he's like, why? And I'm like, trust me. Now I'm gonna refer to it. There's a Carmen in every room. So yeah, so yes, we will discuss that and how that fits within the theory. I don't want to bore you with it right now, but I will share this screen and actually have to move between a couple things because I want to show you the syllabus too in a second. But for those of you who don't know me, if you're watching online, there are a couple people who I haven't met that are taking this class. I'm Dr. Shelby Miller. I'm in my second year as an assistant professor of linguistics here at ETAMU. I'm never going to get familiar with the university's new name. And this class is really modeled after a lot of the research that I do, where and it's great because language research is very interdisciplinary. You can really go so many different directions with it. And I knew early on in my PhD that I was interested in the psychology aspect of it. And not just all of psychology, because that's a very large field, but specifically a specific branch of psychology called personality. Um, and so that's what this class is built on. It's that interest there. It's definitely going to feel like a psychology class, especially the first couple weeks. But we need to kind of have an understanding of that to be able to see how it relates to language. And actually, we will spend 1 week in this class looking at how we can make sense of personality and you who are first language speakers. So there's a lot of research actually on how personality influences the language that you speak. So we'll look at that in terms of English, but then we'll spend the later half of the semester on how it works with learning a language. But I wanted to incorporate both sides, first language and second language acquisition into it as well. You can see the PowerPoint, is that right? Okay. And actually, let me go ahead and do a new share and share the syllabus real quick. I can't tell what I'm doing. Hold on. Screen one. There we go. So we're just gonna do some housekeeping here in the beginning, and then I do have like a short lecture for us today just to get us going. Really quick, as you can see on the first page of the syllabus, this class is now going to meet from 5:30 to 8:10. I'll be very clear up front. I don't know that we'll ever actually go to 8:10, and many of you have families or jobs you're leaving at 5, and maybe you're in a different time zone, so you're not even done till 6 o'clock for us, or you're on the other side of the world. So this is in the middle of the night or morning. And it would go technically for about 3 hours, but I don't think we'll ever go that long. So just you can factor that in if you're ever able to make the face-to-face class. But not a lot has changed since I've emailed this out, but I do want to go over some information so that you're up to date, whether you've been able to look at this or not. I mentioned my office hours is Tuesdays and Thursdays in the morning, but you're all adults who have jobs. So if you need a Saturday to meet with me, we can do a Saturday. You just reach out to me and let me know when you want to meet, and I can usually make something work. So don't feel locked into those office hours. You probably saw the email earlier that we no longer have a face-to-face section, but at every time later further down in the syllabus, I'm sorry, I'm going to scroll all the way down. You can see on our class calendar that most weeks we'll have a live class just like this. Some of them we won't, like next Monday, it's MLK. So there is no, university's not open, but I'm going to pre-record some stuff for you. But anytime the syllabus indicates a live class, plan on me just hopping on Zoom like this and teaching to you face to face. This class does not require a textbook, but I'm writing one for you. And that particular book is going to be called, it's not a clever title because I have to model the series that it's in, but it's extroversion and introversion, what every language a teacher should know. And so the book largely focuses on two personality traits. And they're probably the two, and I focus on those two for several reasons, but one of the reasons is that they're just the most universally recognized traits. You've probably heard those words before and used in some way, maybe even described yourself as one of those in some way. So the book's going to focus on those traits. But there's other research out there on other traits, and we're going to dabble in that as we go as like side readings and side presentations. But largely, again, you don't have to buy a book. We'll use the chapters that I'm writing for this book. This also means, because I'm also writing them right now, that you'll have access to them the week before you would need to read it. So you'll have a week to read a chapter. Chapters are like 5,000 words. Okay, they're not. This is not a 90,000 word book. This is only going to be about 30,000. So I'll be providing that stuff for you for free in the course shell. Because it is a draft of a book, there will be extra credit. I'll build out later in our course shell where if you notice something that's like a very large flaw, even if it's grammatical, you can submit those things for consideration for extra credit points. So I'll build that out and I'll explain that more once we're to the book, which really isn't until I think next week. I've got to give you a chapter. The only thing that actually needs purchased for this class, and I hate to do this because I don't like extra fees and doing that to you, but I'm super stoked to turn the last couple weeks of our class onto another type of personality psychology, which is positive psychology. Now, positive psychology is not personality psychology. It's just a branch of psychology. If you do anything with well-being and hope and joy, those, if you've read, a lot of you might be doing well-being things, financial well-being, physical well-being. You've heard this term used a lot. Work well-being, that's all under this branch of psychology called positive psychology. And there's new literature coming out in SLA on how to incorporate positive psychology into SLA. And there's a specific assessment I want you to take, which is, if you want to buy it from Gallup, it's going to be closer to $27. You can buy, and because it's an assessment you have to pay for, and it's an access code you get so you can go take this assessment. If you've taken this assessment before called Clifton Strengths, you don't need to take it again. You'll just share your results with me. But if you need to take it for the first time, you could buy it from Gallup or you can buy it from me. Because I'm a certified strengths coach, I get a big discount. So this is not, I'm not making money on you. I'm selling to you at cost of what I had to buy it for. We'll get to this again during week 12, but I did want to communicate up front that if money is very tight for you, please let me know. Or if you can plan ahead to set aside this type of money for that assessment by week 12, we will dive into something really cool and unique then. I'll let you read learning outcomes. We do not have any quizzes or tests in this class. It's not content that you can really test over. It really is primarily, you'll see discussions make up the majority of the points. And one of the reasons we're doing that is because a majority of you can't join live. So you're going to have to like interact and reflect with the class in the form of discussion boards, which I know can be tedious and they're not like my favorite instrument. That's where we're going to put our insight together as a class. And what we would do in class here will continue in discussion boards online. If you can make a face-to-face class like today, we'll have Q&A points and stuff. These discussion boards online will have like 2 and 3 requirements, right? So one discussion board might say, do the following 2 things or do the following 3 things. When you attend a face-to-face class, one of those things you will not have to do because you were a part of the discussion of the face-to-face, like, or sorry, the live class. So I'll make those shorter for you, and I'll describe that difference, or I'll detail it out in those assignment pages when those are available. We'll do several assessments. So when I say assessments, I don't mean quizzes, right? I mean personality like assessments. You can't fail them. You can only fail it by not doing them, but they're just going to be links to different personality assessments, and only one of them needs paid for. Everything else I have found like a free link to a suitable tool. Now, Myers-Briggs, anybody familiar with the Myers-Briggs? Okay, I see a couple of you raising your hand. You will, to take the real one, you have to pay for it, but I have a different one you can take that's suitable in comparison, that's free. So most of the stuff there is free. Assignments will have, so just various random assignments, and then a final will basically be an annotated bibliography and research proposal, and you'll kind of be building that actually in the class as you go. I'm hoping you find something interesting in this class that makes you go, oh, if I wanted to study that, I would look at this. And let me tell you, this is a relatively small field compared to just SLA in general. This is like a sliver of things that people study in language acquisition. So there is a lot to actually research. You might actually develop a research proposal that's worth pursuing because it's basically a gap in the literature. And I hope you fall in love with the topic as we go and see how relative it is. So that's the grading structure of the class. There'll be some extra credit, of course. I hope, because this is a grad class, that everyone walks away with an A. I'm very giving with A's as long as like work's being kept up with and it's quality. It's not like it's free A's, but I don't want to give a B. I don't want to give a C. I also can't, it's really hard for me. Many of you have taught before, but like you get a student who got like a 91 in the class, and they got that 91 because they pursued all the extra credit, right? Otherwise they would have had a B, but they capitalized on what they could to get that A, right? And then you've got the student with the 89, and you look and they didn't even try any extra credit. And it's like, to me, it became like an ethical dilemma. I can't roll up the 89 to an A because they didn't put that final touch on, right? So like pursue what you can, take advantage of it. And I basically say, like, you bump your own grade, right? Take advantage of extra credit. If you think you need that, it's going to be there for you. A lot of this stuff is just generic class stuff. I always include something about emailing professionally, but that's really for undergraduates, but I just put it in every syllabus. But I feel confident that you guys send relatively coherent emails. Just talking about our course outline. Today, we're doing our introduction. We'll do a brief history of personality psychology. And so it's going to feel very psych heavy the next couple weeks, because we'll spend the next 2 weeks really focusing on the backbone and the framework to be able to understand the linguistic research. You need to be interdisciplinary in this sense. So I will have chapter 1 available for you this week. I'm sorry, I say this week because I'm highlighting it. Those didactics, right? I'll have it available for you next week to read by week 3. And so you'll be caught up there. And you'll see, this is when, these are the weeks I'm giving you the chapter. So in week 5, I'm giving you the chapter 2, so forth. We will spend week 4 talking about first language. So I'll tell you some like spoiler alerts. We already know some things about how personality is connected to linguistic production. So for example, if you're an extrovert, you likely talk very fast. I am doing that right now. And so we actually have a lot of lexicosemantic and prosodic evidence to suggest that your personality influences like the words you use and how high a pitch you talk in. So we'll look at that so you can really like situate it with yourself before we jump into the second language stuff. And some of you, if you're like me, you're in a linguistics program that's very heavy on TESOL, but you don't intend to do TESOL. Jennifer, I think you're one of those, right? Yeah. So we've got the language learning part of this, but I do want to spend the first 5 weeks just talking about um, SLA aside, right? And then many of you are going to already have questions on like, well, culture, gender, age, all these things influence my personality. Absolutely. We will spend a week discussing that as well, because you need that to make sense of the research later, to really analyze its usefulness in terms of what it can say about language learning and teaching. Just scrolling through here. Yeah, that's pretty much the schedule of the class. Do you have any questions about what you're seeing? All right. Okay. So that's the syllabus. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the course shell. So because they just closed the face-to-face section today, um, I can now update the course shell, but I was waiting till they closed that section because I don't want to update something that then they delete something by accident. So basically here between probably tonight or tomorrow, you're going to see the course start having some content in it. It doesn't right now. It doesn't even have the syllabus in it. But what you will see later this week, hopefully by tomorrow, and I will send you an email once it's available so you know to go look for it. We'll start with our first two modules, and they'll be called Welcome and Start Here and week 1, and then we'll just build it out from there. Textbook I already talked about, and yeah, we'll use I'm writing the textbook, and the only material you'll purchase for the class is that Clifton Strengths Assessment Code. Everything else will be provided to you for free in the course shell. Okay. So awesome. I know we got a handful of you here. I didn't do introductions. I just, out of respect for personality, because that's not everybody's forte. So I'm gonna pass on those. And they're in the discussion post this week. You can elaborate on who you are and what you want to tell us. And so just so you know, we already know from research that normally introverts prefer discussion board types as opposed to on the spot, tell me who you are. And actually that they tend to produce more words when they have time to think about what they want to say or write before they have to do it. So introverts, I'm expecting very good discussion post. But so out of respect for personality, we won't do introductions. But what do you guys, I do want to ask you, for those who want to share, what do you know about personality? When you hear that word, are there assessments you've taken before? Are there things you don't like about it? Because I know Carmen mentioned the ambivert thing. What do you think of with this word?
I know for my oh, go ahead.
Okay.
But
Sorry, my camera doesn't work.
Oh, that's okay, Nikki. No, we'll start with Nikki, then we'll go to Carmen. There we go.
Okay. I was just, so this is not just about personality in general, but I always find it very interesting. People who are multilingual from a young age. My husband, for example, was bilingual from a young age, and depending on what language he's speaking in, he's more introverted in English than he is in Welsh, and he's a little bit more shy when he speaks a certain and in English than he is in Welsh, even though he grew up with them completely side by side. Different aspects of his personality come out depending on his language. And I find that with my students, they have like an opinion about who they are in English versus their first language.
That's fascinating. And which is his first language?
My husband grew up completely bilingual. So he grew up in Wales where English is a dominant language, but he speaks English and Welsh. So
okay, bilingual. Both from the beginning. Oh, okay. I'm sorry if you said that and I missed it. I have a friend who grew up in Nicaragua and learned English very young as well, but she said it took her forever to figure out how to be funny in English, which she was known for being funny in her first language. So that's very interesting. And you mentioned shyness. We're actually going to talk about that pretty early in the semester and some of these other traits and distinguishing those from introversion and stuff. But that's super interesting. And I hope we do tackle that later in one of the books. I'm not sure if we actually get to that, but we should. So if we don't, remind me. I like that idea, that topic. Carmen, go ahead.
All right. So first off, I do want to apologize in the case that you may not hear me too much, because I am on my way home and my daughter's also in the car and she gets very loud. But I wanted to mention that for myself, I kind of had the same type of thoughts that the woman who just spoke. I'm sorry, what was her name?
Nikki.
I didn't catch it. Nikki?
Yeah.
I had very similar thoughts to what she was talking about, because I'm also married to an immigrant, except my husband is from Bosnia, and I have noticed that same type of shift in personality. My husband is much more of an introverted person, and he tends to be very, very shy when he has to, be in public and enter conversations, especially when he has to speak in English, because there's so many things that he may want to say, but he doesn't know how to say it. So a lot of times he'll come to me for help and ask me, like, how do I say this type of thing so that they understand me, or that I come out as understandable, because he definitely has a hard time explaining himself in a way that is comprehensive to others, just because he doesn't have a whole lot of public speaking practice, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I hear you on that too. And so there's a confidence gap too in there too, with what words do I grasp for in this context. Context is huge. And so I think what we'll see, Carmen and Nikki, when we get to that chapter, which will be chapter 2, is this idea that, and I'll mention it a little bit today, but the question is, are personality traits constant, or do they change in context? And I think we have to say yes, which sounds silly, but yes to both, right? And we want to discuss that. We're going to focus on that.
Yes, and then in the case of our daughter, because we have a 2-year-old toddler girl, and unlike my husband and I, she is very extroverted. She loves to talk and play, and have conversation with people. Even if she doesn't necessarily know them, she'll go and approach them if she finds something interesting about them. And then in her case in particular, she does not stop talking at all. She can go on talking for at least 30 minutes until she gets an answer that satisfies her, or if she wants to learn more about that particular person's day. There are times, for example, when she is away from me for too long, and she likes to ask me about how my day is, especially when I tell her that I'm going to school and I have class. She'll ask me about how my class went and if I liked it. And she does that because I tend to ask her about how her day was and and if there was something that she liked about it.
Yeah, and so actually today we're going to discuss a lot of theories that talk about, so whether or not you're very familiar with personality theory, you've probably heard the question, is it nature or nurture, right? And so you described this context with your daughter, and I'm like, well, yeah, if she's got 2 quiet parents, she's got a constant audience. So it's probably like reinforced to some degree, right? And then so is it nature or nurture, because you're nurturing it in. And then we'll also look at a couple theories today that discuss childhood, right? And how pivotal that is. Paige, go ahead.
It's funny because when you said like, oh, how much of this is personality versus context versus both versus nature versus nurture, I'm like, oh, those are all of the things bouncing through my brain when you ask about personality. Because I think about like my experience as a non-native German speaker living in Germany, and I had a like conversational foundation for the language, but I couldn't be as funny in German as I feel I am in English. And so there was this like untethered feeling or disconnected feeling where I didn't quite feel fully myself in a second language the way I do in my first language. And then I was thinking about with the Myers-Briggs, because I've taken it before, but I took it almost 10 years ago now was the last time I took it for like an organization who wanted to see those components, those results. And so I was wondering like, oh, when I take that again, I'm really curious, you know, in all these other ways that I've grown and changed over the last 10 years, what that Myers-Briggs might show now, if it would reflect some of those changes, or am I who I am regardless? And there's like this kernel of self that doesn't change as the context and as the growth has changed. So I'll be interested to see about that. And then just the last thing I thought of my own interest when it comes to neurodivergence in language, as my classmates were sharing stories, and you know, you're kind of giving this encapsulation of what it can look like in our class, or we're coming across it later. I have a lot of curiosity what gets perceived as personality versus how that's impacted by neurodivergence, and what is differences between neurodivergence and processing and language versus personality. Because I think I would be perceived as an ambivert, but that's only because as someone who's neurodivergent, my personality looks very different in a context with other neurodivergent people than it does in a context where I am only surrounded by neurotypical people. And so those two groups of people probably might use different words to describe me, but the levels of energy that it takes to interact with them is very different for me, even though both groups will say, oh, Paige is an extrovert. She has so many words and she talks so fast. But one of those groups is much more draining than the other.
Oh, I
so
love
that's
that.
where like my interest comes in when you start to ask about personality.
I absolutely love that. And I don't, in the first chapter, talked about like the neurodivergence, but I do talk about the distinguishing between how do we separate our study of traits. We're talking about personality traits. So we're building up to that, even though you're not going to see that word used a lot today, and its theory and philosophy from what we know about these other cognitive components. And so how do we, because we're all so educated to an extent, they're all very merged, right? So we're going to actually break down personality trait theory into its basic philosophical components. And we're going to use that as our philosophy for the class, even though we have all these questions on how does it interrelate with other facets of me? How does it interrelate with the fact I'm a woman? Let me give an example. This is going to come much later in week 11, but in Clifton Strengths, there's a strength or talent called command. We're going to call it a personality trait. I love that assessment. We're going to have that you will walk away from this class going, I'm so glad I took this class just for the last 2 weeks of this class. And the rest of the class is great, but I'm telling you, it's life-changing stuff later. But in command, these are people who can take leadership very easy. If someone else is leading, they're fine with it. But if no one will lead, they're the first to go, fine, I'll manage it, I'll take it. But one facet about command is they also tend to be people who say the thing that everyone in the room is thinking, but no one would dare say. Oh, Paige, is this you? Okay. And so usually people are like, man, you're kind of rude or abrupt, or like, read the room, Paige. You know, so I'm not saying it's you for sure, but anyways, they say everyone's thinking the same thing about Jeremy being late constantly and it's slowing the meeting down and all that. Command will say, okay, Jeremy, you're late. This is getting in the way of this, you know. Even though everyone's thinking it, no one's going to have the audacity to say it. So a lot of audacity. But what I'm getting at there is that, you know, gender command can look very different for women and men because there's that environmental thing of women are often called bitches when they're like that. So neurodivergent, shyness, any, or the fact your gender or your age, these are all like really important facets. And conversely, what this class is about, we're all very acutely aware that gender plays a difference, age plays a difference, your cultural upbringing plays a difference. We could even say the language you learned plays a difference, right? There's that Worf, what is it called? Worf hypothesis. I'm missing a word in there, but that the language you learn limits how you can see the world. So this class is arguing those are all great, and personality does it, right? But you can't look at any in isolation, and that's going to be challenging. Sapphire Wharf. Yes, thank you, Nikki. Sapphire. I don't think I've ever actually said that hypothesis out loud, but there it is in the chat.
Appear, but I don't think I've said it
Appear.
out loud before either. So.
Dude, I've got names of philosophers to say later, and I've got the IPA in my notes on the table here because I'm like, we'll see. If you've ever done like a dating app, you've had to describe yourself, right? And usually those are things like, I like hiking and things, but you might say things like, or I'm outgoing, or I prefer, time alone. You're seeking in those moments to actually like examine your behavior and your personality, right? Your attitude on things. Job interviews, very similar, describe yourself in this situation at work. And so you're having to speak about your behaviors and who you are innately and who you think you really are consistently. Before, did anybody have anything else they wanted to add before I moved on? And I want everyone to speak who would like to.
Oh, I'd like to say something, please.
Yeah.
All right, so I know I came later in the conversation, and so I'm Mitzvah for everyone out there. I know sometimes people would ask, am I saying that right? And they avoid saying my name altogether because they're not pronounce it, but it's Mitzvah. One of the things that really stood out to me in terms of even registering for this class was when I thought of the word personality, I really thought about my parents because they're both native Spanish speakers. And that's their first language. I would consider myself a second generation Spanish speaker. And they are completely different in the way that they perceive certain situations when they're using English. And so, for example, my dad, super risk taker. He's not afraid to get in a situation and use whatever resources he has in order to communicate and we can say survive in that situation per se. And that was one of the things that he has gone through all throughout his language journey, right? Now, in terms of my mom, she told me that she had this extroversion as well at the beginning of like her whole journey. But there was a key situation in her life where she said something, she was very excited about it, but the people around her, they actually laughed at her and made her feel embarrassed. Yes. And that was a key moment in her. And well, actually, since then, she says something clicked in a weird way that she has become more shy, that she isn't willing to take risk anymore. And I've noticed that there has been this disposition of making sure everything is accurate, which has hindered some of her progress. In comparison to my dad, he's very more far along in that proficiency. But my mother, on the other hand, she's great in terms of reading and writing, and although everything that's controllable in some sense, I see that difference. And so when I was looking at this class, I thought of it, this is an opportunity to really take a deep dive into that aspect of language journey. So I wanted to share that.
I love that. And I do hope it's useful. And we're going to, it's really funny you use the term risk taker. And when we get into the distinction of extroversion and introversion, and one of the reasons why those two traits are studied the most, there's 3 reasons. Spoilers on the book. There's a short paragraph on this in the book. They got renewed interest in linguistics back in the 90s and early 2000s by some key researchers. So then all of a sudden everyone was like, ooh, big names writing about these. I want to study these. The second is that linguistics aside, when you go to personality theories and just look at psychology, those 2 traits are described as the things that control sociability, socialness, right? Word count, word production. But when you look at psychology, the description of an extrovert, we think of talkative in some things. Those are external behaviors. Look at my TPR kicking in. So, but we have to look at what's happening cognitively. And one thing that's happening inside an extrovert is risk taking, like a propensity to want to take risks. So we see a lot more, in language that has implications and speaking, specifically in speaking a second language. So I'm curious, but I hear a theme between the 3 of you, as 3 of you have mentioned this. How does this roll over and impact? Do I have a different personality in these different languages? I'm going to try to incorporate some of that, but if I don't, I think I'm also hearing your final research proposal also. So please, if something's not addressed, but it's like what interested you in this class, look for components as we're going that you could plug into being that final proposal at the end, for sure. Thanks, Mitzvah. Now, yes, you're right. I would have avoided your name at all costs. So, fluency versus accuracy. Yes, I see Carolyn's comment. Yes, this reminds me of fluency versus accuracy. And we're going to talk, we'll have a chapter where we talk about language, the difference comprehension versus competence and performance. And there's so much research out there, guys, just on extroversion and introversion and how it predicts possible what happens in the language learning process. I do want to go ahead and spoil the conclusion of the book, which is this. And I would love for you to toil over this as we progress, because I think it actually might, I'm curious how this fits in with the several of you who've mentioned like being bilingual and developing personality or trying to develop personality in a second language, or a personality suppressed by the language learning process. I have this argument that will be laid out for you in the book that language learning is largely charging students to be extroverts. And that gets laid out over every chapter. But even in traditionally how we teach, there's this expectation that, Carolyn, I can call you on the spot and you're going to say something back to me as a student. I'm going to pull you out in front of everybody in the class and expect you to speak. And you doing that, I reward you. Like I expect that's a good student to me, right? But that really is just an American extroversion ideology, which we will talk about in chapter 2, being forced on the teaching experience. And so you've got all these American teachers going abroad with this idea of extroversion. I'm spoiling the whole thing, but this gets elaborated on. So basically the conclusion of the book is basically we need to engender first language introverts. So Carmen's an introvert in English. If I wanted to teach her a second language, then I need to teach her how to be a competent introvert in her L2. It's not to make her an extrovert in her L2. It's to basically honor personality and equip the student to be that in the second language. And maybe if there was more focus on that, we would have an easier crossover and not that identity crisis of how do I be me in this next language. So toil over that. It's just kind of like a philosophy I'm concluding the book with that I think would be useful. Anyone else have anything they want to add? Well, I think one thing that went unsaid, but is clearly agreed upon by everyone in here, which is step 1, which is that we all recognize we're very different from each other, right? Even those in this room, I think we are all women. I think everyone in this class is a woman. If you are not, I apologize. I didn't read names and try to assert gender, but in this moment, I think everyone in here is a woman. We're all, none of us are teenagers. We're all adult women. There's so many things about us in here that make many of us very similar, right? Similar are different variables. But even then, I guarantee you, we all have our little differences, right? And so you already buy into the idea that we have different temperaments and behaviors and actions from one another. And that's really where we needed to start, was just to get us all on that same page that that personality exists, right? We're not arguing that it doesn't exist. We're just trying to unfold how it fits in. So I just want to spend some time here getting you up to speed before we get into the heavy lifting of what is an extrovert? What does it mean to be agreeable? These different traits. I want to talk about where this stuff even came from. And so we're just going to do a brief, notice brief being emphasized, history of personality psychology. And notice it says personality psychology, not psychology. Psychology is such a huge branch, a huge field of study. And it's a big umbrella term for lots of different things. We're looking at one little sliver of it, which is the study of personality. So that's what this history tour is going to focus on. If you were just to Google, go to Google, say define personality. Here's the listing of the different definitions we get for that word. And the first definition, which means it's the word's most commonly used this way in our society, is that personality is a combination of characteristics or qualities that form an individual's distinct behavior, or distinct character. And this is really where this class is unfolding. There are other meanings to personality that we're not using, but I have number 3 highlighted as well. Its first original use, because that's where this word first came into English. So to show you, the word personality came, well, we're linguistics, right? So we get to do etymology. The word personality came into English around late Middle English. They think around the time like 1425, okay? And that's just because that's the earliest known written expression of it, right? We don't know how long it had been spoken beforehand. And when it originally entered English, it was in that third archaic sense of the definition, just the quality or state of being human. Personality just means you are human, you're distinct from being an animal or a non-living thing. And so this word came in, we got this word from French, which makes a lot of sense because look at the time period that it entered English, 1150 to 1500. I don't know if you know anything about the history of English, but English wasn't quite yet a language at that time. It was definitely not recognized as an official language because it was shortly around, 14 something, that it became an official language in what's now known as Great Britain, right? But the British Isles, it became an official language because it became the official language of government. But before that, we got the word from French because who was in charge or who were the lead, we'll call them oppressors because they weren't very nice people. That's why we get this notion of we don't like the French, because the French actually were over that area. We had English developing along the way, but French was the lead empire. I don't know if the word kingdom, leading the kingdom at that time. So during this time was the 100-Year War, where we fought the French off and we established ourselves as, we established our own government, and hence English became recognized globally as a language because of that war. But all that to say, it makes sense that the word personality came from French because that's who was in our lives at that time. And we took as much French as we could because it was considered a very prestigious language. I mean, they were leading the government, they were the wealthy. And but still the meaning we took, the way they were using that word was about like, it just means you are human, you're not an animal. But obviously this word, the French got this even further back from Latin. And so you can see there, it's like grammatical changes in Latin and its semantic changes. But the word itself, personality, if you look at its long history, came from the Latin word persona that we use now in English as well, which basically meant mask or character. Okay, so mask in the sense, actors would change their mask during theater productions to represent characters and different personality traits. So I took some, I don't even know if those are authentic Latin, old Roman Latin masks, but that's where this idea came from. They would use this to create different expressions on stage. Henceforth, years later, we get the word personality. I'm going to read the chat as I go, by the way, so if I get quiet, that's what I'm doing. Yeah, yes, the word masking. I don't mention it later in this PowerPoint, but it has a resurgence around the Enlightenment period, which I'm about to talk about, as a way to talk about putting on a mask to change your behavior in a setting. That happened kind of concurrently with all this. So I don't address it again, but it did happen with all this. For the purpose of this class, though, like we're interested in this first sorry, I'm trying to highlight the screen, but I'm sharing it, so I can't do it. We're interested in the first definition of personality, right? And so that meaning literally began to emerge later around the 18th century. So it first meant like appearance or societal role. And so this would be the way an individual presents themselves or is perceived based on their position or function in society. So this is like the person's outward expression or mask that someone wears to fulfill, I guess I do kind of address it again, a particular role in like a public setting. So that's really where it went from a word that wasn't really used again or used. This is basically what I'm trying to say is where you start seeing the emergence of the word used as we are using it today. So at the turn of the 19th century, we're at the onset of the Enlightenment period. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's like pivotal in humanity, but like the age of reason, right? So the intellectual movement emphasizing reason, science, skepticism, and individualism. And that's what's really key. So people as individuals can think. We're arguing in the Enlightenment period, right? People, you're individuals and you have the capacity to think and to do things for yourselves, right? We don't need an authority. It's kind of a down with authority time period. So at this time was the rise of this idea that we are all self-conscious beings that have autonomy. And that's like thanks to philosophers like Kant and Descartes. And their idea that we were all self-conscious beings easily tied into discussions about people being rational beings. So here we have the definition: a distinctive essential character of a self-conscious being. That's what personality began to mean. And by self-conscious being, we mean that people are aware of themselves as individuals, right? You as a person have the capacity to self-reflect. You can recognize your thoughts, feelings, actions, and your own existence, right? You are a rational, smart human being, and you have self-actualization. So this is the time period when psychology really gained traction as a field of study. And it became an official field of study by the 19th century. And we basically, at that point, start getting into that modern definition that we have today. So, but what I want to emphasize here, so I put the modern definition: the combination of characteristics or qualities and self-conscious processes that form an individual's character. And I emphasize the self-consciousness because you're going to see maybe a little bit today, but especially next week, we'll talk about again that not everyone believed that you were consciously aware of your own behavior. You know, it was just happening in you. So again, I want to emphasize though, it's not like, around the Enlightenment period, that's when people first begin to become aware that, oh, we all have different behaviors, like we all have different personalities. Like, no, that discussion actually started much earlier. It's probably much older than what I'm about to tell you, but we actually see, even though personality studied in the field of psychology, the idea of personality and studying temperament didn't actually start with psychology. It started with medicine and philosophy years and years ago. I always say his name wrong. Hippocrates. How do you say his name? I have the phonology.
Like the Hippocratic Oath.
Yeah, I'm putting the stress on the wrong syllable. Yeah, Hippocrates. Name.
I just know it because of the thing you have to say when you're a nurse or a doctor or whatever.
Thank you. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It's the etymology is huge, right? Yeah, Hippocrates. I'm still going to say it wrong. One of my and it's funny. It's really funny. I'm telling you guys, when we get to the study on language use and, first language use and personality, this is like a tendency of some extroverts. Just they tend to use more simple terms as opposed to like these academic. So I struggle to be an academic, but I have good ideas. So I hope you hang with me on that. But basically, this is where the idea of personality actually came from. By a physician and philosopher. And so what he had devised was this theory of humor or humorism. And it was this idea that your personality, your temperament, we're going to interchange those two words, but I mean the same thing, is determined by the liquids in your body that your body naturally produces. So your blood, your phlegm, your bile. So each humor, each liquid was linked to a specific personality type. So if you had, if your blood was a certain type of red, you were found to be more optimistic as a person. If you had black bile, you were found to be depressed. So this was where they thought temperament came from, was like your physiological makeup and the type of liquids your body produced. Then we get to Claudius Galen, who knows, guys, just hang with me if I'm saying stuff wrong, where he actually expanded on this years later, but saying, yes, your bile and all this stuff. Yes, that explains your personality, but it's also how it goes through your organs. So he expanded this to like include more of the body. The main thing from this that I think is really interesting, and it feeds into that, are our personality stable or not, was the immediate idea that we can change your personality with treatment. Okay. So actually from here is where we get ideas like bloodletting, and then also like the practice of using leeches. That all stemmed from this type of thing, this type of belief. But it was like, okay, if you are a depressed person, if I change the liquids in your body and how your bile is produced, I can make you not depressed. So, I mean, at least there was some active research on like addressing depression, right? But we've moved a very long way from that. And of this humoral theory, like it was accepted for a very long time. It wasn't until the 16th and 17th century that we had enough medical advancement that these two physicians could actually say, oh, actually part of this is wrong. Not all of it, but part of it's wrong. And then largely by the Enlightenment period, with the advancement of science, because that was huge in the Enlightenment period, it was fully dismissed, okay? Because what they started to realize was, oh, certain colors of liquid meant you were sick. Like it was a germ illness related thing. Like, oh, and we can treat it, but it's not going to change your personality. So, but what's really cool is that what this highlighted for us is several fundamental ideas that have really stuck with us. The timelessness of this search for personality. And, even though the humoral theory was proven wrong, it did sustain this idea. It does show us the fundamental principle that people differ from one another in their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Like that is something we all agree on. We are all different. And it was also the start of this curious movement of like, okay, well, there must be a way to explain this, measure it, and interpret these differences like in a very meaningful way. So it was kind of the launch of that. And this other idea that people can explain by different types. So even though they categorized people with their the liquids, right? This idea of categorization is very huge in modern society, modern personality theory. So it laid the foundation for basically where everything goes from here. Okay, so it was great. It was a great theory in that sense. So what followed? How did we get from assuming it was like a biomedical thing to to what we have today, where we're talking about like context and all these things? I'm going to minimize the chat real quick so I can see more of the slide. I just want to talk about like how it got to where it is today, and I'll keep it short. And I want you to know this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but it really does illustrate actually some of the questions we were talking about, some of the things we need to explore. And I just want to show you how different the mindset is on personality to where we are now in a modern sense. So this is not an exhaustive list. There's so many more key players that brought personality theory to where it is. But these are like some major players. So we can start, basically a lot of it was philosophers. Okay. Everyone on here is a philosopher except Darwin. Then we get into, because evolutionists also played a major role, but philosophy really gave it its bump. And we see Plato and Aristotle working with it very on, this idea of self and awareness. That was a big thing with him. Plato, his main idea that he contributed to personality is that the idea that personality is deeply connected to like an inner spiritual self and moral development, right? So the soul. And Aristotle, from there, he had a more practical view. He suggested that personality is shaped by your actions, your habits, and also the development of virtues. So rather than like innate factors or the metaphysical ideas, like soul and spirit, he said, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. I've heard iterations of that quote before, but it's coming from this idea when he's talking about personality. But what it means is personality isn't static or innate, but something that is shaped through one's actions and choices. So, emphasizing the importance of consistent behavior. But what he's saying here is like personality is not consistent. It can change. That's one of those arguments. Can personality change or not? The major movements after Plato and Aristotle, like when discussion of personality is revived, is notably during the Enlightenment period. So that's the rest of our scholars I'm talking about are from there. But Locke, he argued that people are born as a blank slate. You've heard the tabula rasa, right? So people are born without inherent ideas. And then personality is then developed through experience. So it's shaped by experience and memory. And you develop personality over time. You're not born this way, okay? Vico argued that human beings developed their understanding of the world through a process of like collective imagination and historical development. So what he's really saying there is that it's almost this idea of evolution, but it's a social evolution, not a science, biology, evolution. It's the idea that socially, as a human, you have this conscious that kind of collects memories over time with every generation, and that's what shapes behavior. We're actually going to see this idea of collective memory again next week. It's kind of interesting. But yeah, so your personality is shaped by the fact that you are like 20th generation of your family, right? And in the certain culture you're in. Montesquieu. Just kidding. Montesquieu. Okay, yeah. My IPA was actually really hurting me. Montesquieu. I know that name. He believed personality was shaped not just by like the individual, so you have a role in it, but strongly by society and environment. So you live in America, we have certain rules, morals, ethics, laws. All those things shape your behavior, which I think we can agree to some extent, right? This to me is getting more in sociology. So your customs, culture, those are huge. We will talk about that again in week 5. But also like your environment shapes your personality. So he literally thinks, for example, he said something like colder climates produce more like disciplined, industrious people, where warmer climates make people more relaxed and more like emotional. So, I mean, I guess that's why people go on beach vacations. That's kind of the idea, right? Hume also believed that personality was made from experiences, but that it's constantly changing. It's fluid, okay? Which challenges this idea of that it's permanent. So you're seeing some of these same arguments we didn't figure out. We've been asking these questions for 400 years. Kant, rather than being, I believe that personality, rather than being determined by experience, right, as Locke thought, or actions, as Aristotle thought, he viewed that personality was basically comes from the individual's ability to act according to reason and ethics. So personality is like an autonomous, self-legislating, ethically grounded thing. So we're kind of going back to some of Plato's stuff there. Okay, so those are some major philosophers that really set the ground for where we are now. And there were other key players, not just philosophers and evolutionists, but another notable character was Darwin. And he really is who sparked this idea of nature versus nurture. He set the stage for understanding personal development as the result of an interaction between genetics and environmental factors. So yeah, nature, nurture, genetics, nature, nurture, environmental factors. So a lot of modern psychology theories view personality the way we do as a result of what Darwin actually introduced us to. So that also the idea that he would argue your personality is largely inherited, and that you created your personality
I'm
like
doing
as an
my
adaptive
class
response.
in your room. Is that okay?
Oh, Carmen, can you mute yourself? I'm going to mute you. There we go. So cool stuff. You've heard a lot of this. You maybe didn't know who said what, but now you have that in mind. And so you can see the idea of personality took like a lot of shape during that Enlightenment period and into the 18th century. And at the same time, psychology as a field of study is emerging, right? So they haven't found each other yet. Psychology hasn't claimed it just yet, but they do by the 19th and 20th century. Personality, the conversation about personality as we know it today is picked up largely by psychologists. So philosophers and everybody else still have an interest in it, but they work advanced because of psychology. And that's where we get today's definition. The definition now for personality is found from psychology. and it is the enduring configuration, enduring, right? So that's already implying that they don't change much, depends what theory you're looking at, of characteristics and behavior that comprise an individual's unique adjustment to life, including major traits, interests, drives, values. We're going back to, Plato, Aristotle at that point, self-concept, self-consciousness, right? We're seeing that in the Enlightenment period, abilities and emotional patterns. Various theories explain the structure and development of personality in different ways. We're going to look at those next. But they all agree that personality helps determine behavior. So that's the line there. Everybody agrees that personality influences how you behave. It influences your thoughts, feelings, and behavior. When we talk about this phrase personality theory, you know what a theory is, but these are just ways to understand the nature of who we are, how we develop, and what makes us different from one another. So we're going to look at some of those theories in a second. But these are just frameworks that help explain patterns of how we think, feel, and behave, things that make us unique, right? So I'm going to try to see if there's something else I want to add on that. A lot of these theories also dive into the psychological processes, right? So not just distinguishing behavior visually, but also like what's happening internally. So I just want to quickly talk about the major, some of the major ones. You've heard a lot of them before. Positive. We're just going to briefly talk on a few points with each of them. But really in this class, there are two we're going to focus on. We spend the next 2 weeks just looking at these two. It's typology theory and trait theory. These are very distinct theories, but you wouldn't think so when you look at modern research because they confuse the two of them. So you're about to be much smarter than most researchers out there in linguistics who use these theories because they're very different. And that's one of the problems we have with this field is that a lot of people say, oh, I want to look at personality and adult language learners. I'm going to use this personality instrument. They'll all take this test. Great. So now I know how personality explains language, but then they don't understand where the instrument came from. And that makes a huge difference in how we can interpret these results. So we're going to talk, be with typology theory and trait theory. If you've taken the Myers-Briggs, you have to, or Enneagram. Anybody taken Enneagram before? Yeah, quite a few of you. That is typology theory. You might just think of it as a personality trait test, right? But it's typology. If you've taken like the big 5, anything that ranked you as, well, not anything, because Myers-Briggs says this too, that ranked you as like extrovert, introvert, agreeable, or neurotic, or those things, those are trait tests. We're going to be in trait theory in most of this class, but we do need to learn about typology theory. So how did we get to trait and typology theory? Here are other theories that are very major. A lot of them very major still right now. A lot of them have died out. Notice the first name is Freud. I hope you hear that name and immediately go, oh, and don't think that we're going to build anything in this class on Freud. Actually, typology theory, Carl Jung, and trait theory, Gordon Allport, both created their theories in response to Freud. Like, you're nuts. Here are these theories instead. Most of the theories here came from in response to how nuts people thought Freud was, right? So Freud, if you're not familiar with him, he had the psychoanalytic theory. And this emphasized that unconscious drives and early childhood experiences played a fundamental role in shaping personality. He also does the id, ego, and superego stuff. We don't need to talk about that, but you're probably familiar with like the sexual stages of childhood or whatever, and that stuff, right? So a lot of people had problems with that. But a major thing they had a problem with was this idea of the unconscious. So that's one of his key elements that people were fighting against. Also this weird sexual stuff, don't get me wrong, but what he's saying is that you are influenced unconsciously by things, and these things that you are completely unaware of influence your behavior, right? And you can only access those unconscious things by things like dream analysis or slips of the tongue, right? The Freudian slip. I think I called a Tardo dad once, and I guess you would read into that to say, I have a great dad. There's no like background there. Freud would say I would call him my dad. No, I don't. I just called him dad once. That would be a Freudian slip, right? So the focus on the unconscious is one of the key elements here that that most these other theories are like, no, people, because what did the Enlightenment period teach us? Like, you are a conscious individual. You are aware of yourself. I don't think these are not necessarily in order of how they were devised. These again are just major theories. I don't know which one came first or last or anything like that. Freud though was first. I can tell you that. It's largely thought that like personality as a field of study was either due to Freud or because there was so much backlash against Freud and all these theories emerged that that's what really launched it, right? Behaviorism, you've probably heard of like operant conditioning and all that. That's what learned behavior. That's what we get with behaviorism. Your personality is shaped by learned behaviors through conditioning and reinforcement. We can make that joke with Carmen's daughter that she's learning these extroverted tendencies because she's in an environment where it's being reinforced and supported. Like, tell me more, tell me about your day. Again, all theory, Carmen, who knows, right? Humanistic theory, this focuses on the idea
You're
that
partially
people,
correct.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah. I mean, at some point, if you just made her feel stupid, she'd probably stop. I'm not saying to do
Well,
that.
you know,
No.
I kind of taught her how to communicate and express herself. But I also enrolled her in Montessori school that we have here.
Right.
Because, you know, since I have teaching experience, I feel that it would be best to enroll her in a school that can help her really develop her social emotional skills along with the rest of her cognitive skills. So she gets to really practice different things there. And she takes it home. And then she loves being surrounded by other children. Doesn't matter what their ages are. If she can find a way to play with them, she will.
Yeah, that's a good outlet to support her traits, her budding behavior.
Yeah.
The humanistic theory, you guys have probably all actually practiced a lot. If you're into like mindfulness and stuff, this kind of plays into that. But this one thing about this theory that's interesting is that it presumes people are good. That's a whole different debate. Are you born good or are you bad? It could be religious debate. It could just be philosophical, whatever. But we want to go back to Freud here, who assumed people were born with problems, right? Humanistic theory is in response saying, no, people are good. People are really good people. And that they're motivated to grow. They want to achieve their potential, find meaning in life. And so a lot of self-actualization. So that's kind of like Maslow introduced the hierarchy of needs here. If you're familiar with that, that's out of humanistic theory. Rogers did like basically the importance of unconditional positive regard, I think is the phrase, and the self-concept. So like those things make a healthy personality. So humanistic theory is not so much about where it comes from, but viewing humans as good people pursuing good personality behaviors, okay? Social cognitive theory, also big names, Bandura. Many of you probably heard of that, especially in an education class. So your personality is shaped by like your thoughts, like an interaction between your thoughts, behaviors, and environment, okay? So you get this idea of like reciprocal determinism. Your thoughts influence your behaviors influence your environment, but then your environment influences your behaviors, which influences your thoughts, and it's kind of this cyclical, dynamic, three-way thing. I don't hate it. I think we're all kind of discussing some of those things earlier, like, is it just one thing or the other, right? So basically, any of these three things will influence your actions. So we will see this idea pop up again over the next couple weeks, but it is different from typology and trait theory. That's what I want to stress. These all of these have some very different philosophical or answering very different questions. So then we've got, let's see here, evolution and biological theories. These could be two different bullet items, but I just merged them together. But basically, these theories emphasize evolution, genetics, brain structure as things that influence your behavior, right? So Buss explains that personality traits are adaptation. You're adapting to environmental challenges and survival needs. let's see here, Isink. I was going to say Isink. He linked personality to the brain. So like your behavior has to do with the chemical things happening in your brain. That something's happening chemically, which either arouses you, so you behave certain ways, or is tempered, so you don't. I mean, they're all really interesting theories, right? We're all trying to make sense of what's happening, what's creating personality. I got to mention one more person, and we're going to see them again, which is Michel. And he argued that personality traits are not consistent as previously thought. A lot of these other people are like, yeah, they're pretty consistent when you're both, you carry these behaviors for a long time, but that they can vary significantly across situations. So he emphasizes context. He said context outrules personality. We've been discussing a little bit of that with some of your questions. I think they work concurrently, and we'll do some exercises in the next couple of weeks that make you kind of hopefully reframe and help you bring to my personal opinion on it. But I don't think context is to be disregarded. It absolutely isn't. But this is really big. It's a big idea. Often one of the key reasons why personality research can get dismissed, because people are big into this guy. But some of these ideas, were you gonna say something?
So
Carmen?
I really quick, I have one question. If there's such a backlash against Freud for the reasons you listed, which is totally understandable, why do you think that he's still taught to some degree within the school system?
Is he like, are you guys saying that? It's so weird because I grew up in systems where he was laughed at. Can I say?
I remember being taught about him because of how he described early childhood experiences and how that can create trauma and other things like that. That's what I remember.
So I think he is big. And wait, let me pause, Carmen, and see if anybody else had something to consider and then or to contribute, and then I'll wait.
So I got my bachelor's degree in psychology in 2005, which is 2 decades ago. And way back in the Stone Age when I graduated, we learned about him in like history of psychology. Like and 20 years ago, we were learning about it in a historical context, or it didn't even matter. It was like learning about an iron lung. Or like
that makes sense. Well, as I'm teaching it here. Yeah.
So that's my 2 cents.
Oh, in my case, I got my bachelor's degree in English and Spanish, and all the way through my master's degree as well, in terms of a literary lens. So doing a psychoanalysis over this text or this, and that's how I've usually seen it, aside from all the other comments that I've heard those as well.
I'm really interested in that, by the way, Mitzvah. I might have to talk to you because I see research, personality theory applied to literature. It's really interesting to me. I've not stopped to read any of it. I see Freud. Yes, Jennifer, to put us in the same age there, that was when I got my psych degree, and it was discussed. It was largely dismissed as well. It's just part of how where we are now grew. And like I said, a lot of people created their theories in response to Freud to say, you're nuts. I don't know what's right, but I know that's wrong. But one thing Freud does, and this comes back to the idea that people are innately good, is Freud thinks people are innately messed up. And so you do see him a lot more in abnormal psychology. And so psychology, we'll actually hit on this a lot when we get to positive psychology at the end, but there's a lot of, what's the word I want here? Detriment fixing, I think is the phrase I want. A lot of people use personality theory to fix themselves. And that's a different mindset. That's one way to use personality. It's not the healthy way. It's not a positive psychology way. So we have to understand that personality trait theory, as we're going to use it now, is assuming essentially a normal individual. What's normal? We don't want to. We're not. It's a very loose statement. We're not going to go into define that. But there's a whole other branch of psychology that deals with fixing people. Personality traits should not be that branch, but it is largely misused that way. So again, to say, I see Freud referenced pretty actively in like abnormal psychology, talking about like issues of the mind and behavior issues and and things like that need psychological intervention. Does that make sense? Anybody else have it? And I didn't say this earlier, but I do want you to know, anytime you want to speak, like, feel free to raise your hand or interrupt me. Zoom kind of makes it weird to have some dialogue like that. And I talk quickly, so you're not going to feel like you have a gap, but please chime in and we can, reset the stage so you can add your 2 cents, because I like your 2 cents. Some of the ideas here you're going to see again is what I want to emphasize. But these theories, just know they're very different than typology and trait theory. Some of them spend more time focusing on where does it come from? Is it genetics? Is it neurological? Is it from childhood? So they spend a lot more time on how did you become, where is the basis of personality, right? Is it the soul? Some theories are heavy on that. Others are maybe more heavy on how it develops. Like, do you start a certain way and grow into it? Is it reinforced? Are you always that way? Does it change? Does it not change? I mean, these questions kind of are interrelated. And some, whether it changes, I will say a majority, I have this note here, a majority of the theories out there agree. So if you want to just accept this as truth because of consensus, popular vote, agree that once you're in adulthood, your personality stays relatively the same. And again, we'll talk about context, but I think there's some truth to that. But that's basically a premise that a lot of studies have shown, that adulthood, like, you're pretty consistent at that point. It might change a bit in context, but you have a preference and a propensity to be one thing over the other. And we'll see a little more of that in week 5. But and one thing typology and trait theory does, which we are going to do in this class, is we're going to spend less time on where it comes from, less time on how personality develops and whether or not it changes. We will address those over the next 2 weeks. But at some point, we're going to have our own philosophy for this class. Like, we're going to accept trait theory and typology theory, and we're going to use those as our principles to move forward. And these 2 theories, especially typology theory, it does have an opinion on where personality comes from. This is Carl Jung, right? So we've got the conscious mind and all that stuff. We'll see again next week. But we really want to focus on the applied part of personality. We went into the theoretical. This class majorly is on the applied. How do we use personality instruments? How do we observe behavior? What is going on in the mind? We will spend time on that because you have to in order to understand personality theory. And one reason I bring that up is because, by and large, most of the research shows that extroverts will talk more than introverts, okay? And you almost want to, that probably makes some sense, because when you look at the definition of extroversion and introversion, extroverts tend to be highly social, right, and talkative. Literally, they're defined that way. But there are contexts where that's not the case, especially in task-based contexts, like 2 people working on a task. So that's the stuff we want to be discussing, is how is personality applied to situations. Specifically, we'll look at SLA in the classroom there. But there are some typology theory and trait theory does have some opinions, and we'll just explore those and kind of adapt those as our lead foundation for the class. But we're all very smart, so we can question it too. I hope the applied side is meaningful, because it's like you get stuck in the theory, and then all of a sudden, though, you just start operating on trying to understand extroversion and introversion in a visual sense and seeing it manifest in people, and then it makes sense in a different way. So we do want to focus on how it's realized around us, and the other traits. I just use those as the main ones. That's the lecture. Let me just talk real quick, and then I'll just open the floor for questions. Because the course shell is not built yet, you don't have these 2 assignments, but these are the first 2. You'll have your first personality assessment, and it's a joke. It's what do your favorite pizza toppings say about your personality? It's meant to be a joke to gear you up to think about personality as a legit area of research and assessment. But you'll have that. And then the discussion board, you'll discuss your results, you'll introduce yourself, and I'll have a third prompt in there for the online students who weren't here that you will not need to do since you are here live. But these will be due next Monday. They'll be relatively simple. So even if you have 6 or 5 days to do it, it won't be in-depth work. But next Monday, we do not have class because of MLK. So I will get a pre-recorded lecture of some type up for you guys at that time. But that's it. I am here for questions, to chat, other ideas that surfaced as we were together.
You might have already answered this, but I was wanting to know, because you mentioned that today's researchers get typology theory and trait theory confused a lot, as if they're the same thing when they're not. And is it because, like, why is that? Could it be because they misunderstand the true meanings, or?
You have researchers from a discipline like linguistics who don't know the difference. And so they're taking Myers-Briggs, which is typology theory, and they're using that assessment in the classroom. And they're saying, okay, these students I had this many extroverts, this many introverts. So I had 5 extroverts. I had 4 introverts. Those were the personality traits. And now I'm going to make these conclusions. But Myers-Briggs instruments are meant to measure types. So ENFP, INTJ. In theory, you have to use all 4 characteristics because the theory is that they interplay with each other. Trait theory doesn't disagree with that, but it definitely recognizes that you can study traits in isolation. So what you have are people basically using an instrument, and it's common practice now. We're not going to change the world, but I did this for my dissertation because that's what people are doing. They're using typology instruments to measure traits, and that's not what they're for. Is there a long-term implication? No, but it's just sad to see that, oh, you don't know the theory. That's why you're calling it this. It'd be like using the Enneagram, you get a number or a color right, but then disregarding that completely and going inside the description to just pull out words you want to say something about those words instead of the fact that the not being a 9 means something, right? Isn't it with Enneagram, you get like a lead number and then some supporting numbers? So I'm like drawing like a branch, an Enneagram branch.
They call it a wing, I want to say. So like, I know that I'm a 1. That's the most heavily where my type traits fall. And then I could move closer to a 2 or back on the circle closer to a 9. So you have people who are like, oh, I'm a 1 wing 9, or oh, I'm a 1 wing 2. And it means we match in this way, but some of us lean in this direction and some of us lean in this other direction. But we have these core set that all, like, this is what makes a 1 a 1.
Gotcha. Okay, so if I want to do a bunch of research on 1s and I say all my 1s did this, period, this describes every 1, and I disregard that your wings were this, well, then that research really isn't describing exactly everything that's happening there. And that's like using the Myers-Briggs to just look at 2 personality traits rather than the 8, because the 8, we'll call them wings, like Enneagram does, all play a role. And it would say in Myers-Briggs typology theory, being an extrovert is a trait, but being an extrovert judging perceiver is one personality. Being an extrovert perceiver is a personality. Being an extrovert judger is a different personality. You're both extroverts, fine, but you are very different because of these, we're going to say wings because that's just a common term for us. So, but we've got everybody saying, oh, this person's an extrovert, this person's an introvert, and not acknowledging the wings, which you can do. And that's what they've done. But it's just to me highlights an issue with interdisciplinary research. If you need to know the other field, so you're using the right instruments and calling it the right thing. I don't know that it has a ton of negative implications in that sense. But you will see many language researchers use Myers-Briggs or those typology instruments to measure traits, and it's just more like, oh, it's not called that. It's a typology. You should have used Big 5. You should have used something else that were actually researched traits, right? Judging and perceiving, if you take a Myers-Briggs, are not researched traits. People look at other things and other instruments, right? So it might just be more of a peeve on my end. Yeah, so we're gonna actually, I went into a lot of it, but there's so much more we'll get into with the distinction of those two. And they really are theory distinctions for the most part.
I'm just thinking about from a teaching perspective, how like what an inefficient use of time to give a class a Myers-Briggs exam rather than like, I like to participate out loud in class or like true, false. I feel nervous if the teacher calls on me without giving me time to prepare. True, false. I prefer to write down my answers. Like the actual actions and the actual like I don't need to know all these other things about you. What I want to know in the context of our classroom is how do I make you feel comfortable to participate? And here are different ways that these are options of participation and ways to show me your understanding that you can let me know which ones are your preferences or which ones you feel comfortable with. Why would I go through a Myers-Briggs just to pull out introvert, extrovert, and then try to apply that? That doesn't.
Oh, okay.
I don't have
send
time
you
for
guys.
that. Like no one in the public school system has time for that.
No, and you don't have time to learn like each trait. Okay, I'll send you my book proposal, the one that I'm writing for this class. Chapter 1 ends with an extrovert introvert assessment for teachers, which you'll have taken a different one. I'm giving you different links. But it's for, I'm thinking also people in other countries who don't maybe have access to all the same links we do. And then links, what's it called? Link aging, or where you know, they're not good anymore after people don't upkeep their websites. This end of the second chapter is a simplified extrovert introvert personality assessment. Keep in mind, chapter 2 deals with context. That is, first of all, the goal was to be simplified English, which is basically a way of saying like not beginner, but intermediate might English learners could do. So it's not going to say things like, are you aware of reality and its self-consciousness of, you know, these words, right? Things that I'm trying to only use words that are used actually in that type of curriculum and higher. It's built on the context of the classroom. How can you understand who's an introvert in your classroom, and distinguishing that? And so I also need the educator, you know, to be mindful of, like, we need to distinguish introversion from shyness. We need to distinguish extroversion from attention seeking. Those are disorders that need addressed. Extrovert and introvert are not disorders, okay? But it is built exactly, Paige, for what you're saying, so that it can just be used for a teacher in the classroom who can then go inform herself of what those traits mean by reading this book, but you have a basic understanding of where your student may fall. But all the questions are posed as situations like classroom situations, just like that. So, and now I haven't done a reliability and validity test on it yet. So one of the assignment options, or I think is like, you guys can go try it with some people. You're going to have them take an extrovert introvert assessment that's online. And then you'd have them take this little paper assessment. We're just looking for, you know, validation, basically, that they show up as extrovert on both or introvert on both. So we're going to learn a little bit about reliability and validity over the next couple of weeks too. But I'm so glad you said that, because I was thinking language teacher. I think even though it can be used with young students too. It doesn't have to be language learners, but there needed to be a simplified version of these tests with 10 questions. Scenario-based, easy to read scenarios, so that people can use it in the classroom, and also free.
Yeah.
So
when I taught in the public school context, I taught 8th grade and I taught across content. So I taught social studies classes that were like mainstream, all my students, 8th grade social studies. And then I taught an 8th grade and 7th grade ESL class. And the questions I'm asking in the context of language learning, I would ask the same questions or want to ask the same questions of students in my social studies class, because I want to find out how best to include you in participating in a way that it might push you a little bit, but I'm not shoving you way out of your comfort zone in front of other teenagers who are your peers who you don't want to embarrass yourself in front of. And like, or these different aspects of like, how do I give you options for showing your comprehension? What are things you prefer? Do you like being able to give a presentation and share with your class, or would you rather write something and it's just coming to me at the end? Like you said, I think, having a set of 10 to even 15 questions, that's not just language specific. In my experience as a teacher, that goes across content when it comes to just learning more about your students. And it makes me think of like, oh, in a first week where we're having to learn routines and procedures and behavioral expectations in a classroom, that would be a very helpful tool to use in that intro week of school.
And if I may, Paige, I think that also applies to adult learners. I'm currently teaching adult learners, and many times, if there's, because I like to do a lot of unofficial assessment. I'm not big on standardized assessments because I feel like they don't necessarily address or necessarily show the actual level of comprehension of the students. But anyway, I have noticed that if my students are not so confident in their English language abilities, they may not choose to answer a direct question if I happen to ask them a question. So what I normally try to do is whatever questions I ask of them, I try to ask it in such a way that they can relate it to their personal lives so that they're more comfortable in asking them. And then in my particular case, I like to teach the beginner level courses just because I like
Bye, Nikki.
teaching
Sorry, I just
that
wanted to say bye
yeah.
to Nikki real quick.
No,
She's
you're
heading
good.
out.
Yeah, but I like to teach the beginner level courses because I enjoy teaching the foundational stuff and then helping build up their confidence over time. So when you're teaching in that context of a beginner level type course, the students are naturally more inclined to speak in their native language if possible, which in my case, it's very possible because I am bilingual. I speak English and Spanish, and many of my current students are Spanish speakers. So they have that level of comfort where they know they can answer me in either language and I will be able to understand them. But after a certain point, I try to stop them from using their Spanish speaking ability so much, because I don't want them to see me as a crutch, especially when they're, outside of the classroom and in the real world and interacting with many different people of different ethnicities and races, and they're not necessarily bilingual. So I want them to be able to build up their English speaking abilities, to be able to conversate comfortably with other people, regardless of whether or not they happen to know their native language.
Remind me, it just hit me while you were talking, Carmen. That remind me when we have these classes, if I forget to stop for a break and you need one, just go take it, or someone put in the chat like, hey, it's been an hour and some, let's take a break. We don't need one right now. We're obviously almost done, but I was just thinking like, oh, because I can talk quite a lot, I will forget to do that. What I really hear from those who are actively teaching is just something that reaches the student where they're at. And that's what I'm hoping the assessment, the little simple slide 1 can do the simplified assessment can do for teachers. Give them something simple, they can answer it easily, but then give you just a basic starting point to understand who they are. And then there's the question of, you've taken a personality assessment, then you take it again 4 years later, it's slightly different. I mean, the best thing you can do and you get to do as an adult is just have some self-awareness. There's also the other issue of, we know that when you complete an assessment, it has a degree of accuracy as long as you are a self-aware individual, right? But not everyone's like that. Some people who like can't read themselves. It's like, whoa, get a clue. Then then there's also an approach where you have someone take it for you. So the observational approach where they observe you and take it. And so usually it's helpful if someone knows you well takes it.
So what happens to the validity of results when you have people who are so highly self-aware that you understand the implications of the answers that you're choosing?
So they would say, for personality assessments, and this is what's important, and I will advise this of you, don't go jump online right now and take a ton, or if you do take one that I need you to use later in this class, give me those results, don't take it again, because the best time for you to take it is when you are the most unaware of the instrument. So it's just like any research, right? Being too familiar with the instrument or the topic is going to
or like other assessments I've come across in different like neurodivergence assessments and things like that, that like, I know you're asking me for the same thing, just rewording it 10 questions later.
Could you
Or
provide an example?
Like, for example, one of the questions will be something like, do you prefer going to a museum or a music concert? And if you're screening for neurodivergence, for the context, it says something to choose the museum, because what's the context of a museum? It's very quiet. You can have much more limited social interactions without negative feedback because you're expected to be quiet in those spaces. It's much less, there's a lot less sensory stimulation. Think of the lighting in a museum. It has to be like, particular lighting is too harsh for exhibiting arts and statues and displays. So lighting is generally more neurodivergent friendly. When I read that question, I'm like, oh, if I pick the museum, says one thing. If I pick a music concert, says something else. But it's also very frustrating because this dichotomy it's a false dichotomy. Because what kind of music concert? Can I bring loops? Can I bring headphones? Can I bring, like, am I going with a friend who we both love this music, or we are going to support a friend who's playing? Like, it tries to put it down into these two in a false dichotomy. And I know what the implications are of choosing one or the other while I'm trying to be assessed based on my responses.
Oh, okay.
I have two responses for
Yeah, and then later, here's a question 10 questions later that's again trying to get at this idea of like lower levels of stimulation and interaction versus higher levels of stimulation and interaction. It's not.
I think one, this is a sign that you should be now researching it as you are and devising your own instruments. This is like a good commentary. I know when you have people take these assessments, the scenarios are hard to build, and all these assessments you're going to take are going to be pretty much scenario based. Like, you prefer to read a book or socialize, Likert scale, choose the side type of a thing. So what I found is, because I know so much, I'm like, oh, I need to be teaching this because now I could make these, right? But then you get an assessment like Clifton Strengths, which I'm so pumped for you to take. And the questions, you'll come across one that's like, I prefer a museum, I prefer concert. Next question, I prefer to read, I prefer to socialize, or to meet friends for dinner. So what you get are quiet, experiences, and then you get these more social, like louder experiences, and then you keep seeing more like that. And they're distinguishing between, do you like learning and taking in information? Are you a quiet, reserved person? They're actually all measuring a couple things at a time to find not just introversion, extroversion, but like there's so many traits like learner, input.
But even when you ask about reading a book, I throw in the wild card of, right, but what if I'm reading a book and body doubling? Or what if I'm reading a book in silent parallel play where we're both reading silently, but we enjoy sharing space together and we occasionally check in with one another? Like,
so you're very context heavy on like, I need this really described, like a unique scenario, specific scenario described. And so one thing in the first chapter is just talking about preferences, it might help remove the context idea, but what are you most of the time? And you just really have to simplify it that way. What are you most of the time? What are you going to choose most of the time? Is there one of those two scenarios? Let's say the museum scenario is the best possible scenario you could build, where you're like really enticed by that. Build the concert scenario to the best possible scenario it could be, then which one do you want to choose?
Then my brain
And
says,
that-
don't make me choose. I
Yeah,
love them both.
but you do have a preference because someday you have to make that choice, right? And so that's what we talk about is preferences, how you lean towards one side or the other. You can exist in the middle, but at the end of the day, you'll do an exercise in the book with your hand, writing your name 5 times with your dominant hand. You'll do it again with your non-dominant hand, and then we discuss like how you have a dominant hand, you have a dominant personality. You can still use the non-dominant one. Your handwriting would still be somewhat legible. It can still get the job done. You know when to pull it out. But if you want it quick and easy and natural, you have a dominant hand for that reason. You have a trait, a personality trait that's dominant in that sense too. But you can be the other one. So yeah, it's hard.
That's a very helpful clarification though. Like that's a very helpful lens to put on it in terms of that, like dominant versus non-dominant. And both will work, but like this is the one I reach for or reach with, right?
Have any of you taken like research methods, any of the research methods courses? I'm thinking specifically oh my gosh, what's the numbery one? Did you ever see why are they called quantitative and qualitative? Why aren't they called like Feely and numbery, the research approaches? But anyways, this idea of triangulating your research, coming at your data from 3 points, right? Do that with personality assessments. Take one, take a different one, take a third one, because every one you take, you're going to read elements where you're like, that doesn't describe me. Maybe some of it does, some of it doesn't. When you take 3 different ones, you start to see a pattern emerge from the 3. You've triangulated your data, and that can help you make sense, bring awareness to real tendencies, right? Myers-Briggs breaks people down into 8 personality traits. Big 5 breaks people down into 10 personality traits. Clifton Strengths does 34. I love it because it is very distinct. It takes this idea of extroversion and says, yeah, but there's 8 different types. It takes this idea of introversion going, yeah, there's 8 different types. So what you start to find when you get these really broad stroked assessments of like 5 different types of people, there's still things in those big descriptions you're like, that's not me. That one's not me. Maybe I can be that. So you're looking when you triangulate to look for the broader themes. That can usually help help with that awareness piece of like, okay, I accept these pieces of who you say I am because it's shown up 3 times now.
Yeah, it reminds me of the concept of a prototype. And so if someone says bird, we might be considering like a crow or a common bird. We hardly will associate it with a penguin or an ostrich, but they're still part of the same category. And so in this case, there are certain elements or traits that would be more central, but the other ones are still present, but probably not at the same intensity. That's what I'm gathering here from this part of the conversation.
I love that comparison. I like that a lot. Yeah, what are those? What it's covered in English 555? Those semantic trees is what I was drawing to mind when you were saying that, right? Is that what they're called? I don't teach that class. I just took it once. Excuse me.
Yeah, that's what they're called.
Everything's so interrelated. Everything's an analogy for something else. Well, I'm excited to see your assessment results, and we're going to kind of, when you take those assessments, the instructions will be clear on, you're going to actually access a Google sheet where all of your names will be. And so we're going to post our assessments together in one group. So as we take each one, we can look at the makeup of the class, which is kind of the meta experience of this for me, because you are taking a class with someone who's very extroverted, who's very adaptable and go with the flow. And I teach like that. We can railroad the topic and end up somewhere else, and I can go with that. It's also someone then who organizes the course shell last minute. Now, for the record, it's not set up because of me. This was an IT issue, but because I'm flexible, I can go set it up now. I'm fine with that. But you might get the reading 6 hours later than I promised you, or something like that. So because I'm highly flexible and go with the flow, I also, in that way, to students, I'm flexible with you. I'll go with the flow with you. So that's part of, you'll see how your personality kind of builds your teaching style. But I also get the experience of knowing your personalities along the way. I know my J's will love the way I organize my judgers. That's that Myers-Briggs, that organized discipline category. They're going to love the way I organize my course shell. It's very good. You're also going to be like, hey, where's the recording from last night? Still not up. You're going to nudge me a little bit. I already know the things you're going to love and the things you're going to be like, oh, that's not how I am. But we get to have that together. And so it's that we get a meta experience in the class at the same time.
And as far as the assignment about the pizza toppings and assessment, what if you're a picky person like me and you don't naturally like a whole lot of pizza toppings?
It will probably be a result. I'm sure it is. It's just a junk test. And the point of it is to illustrate that there's junk psychology out there.
Is it the BuzzFeed test?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, Carmen, you'll have an option. You'll have options. Don't worry.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
It's meant to illustrate that it's a lot of it's like fake pseudo like stuff too. But people are so innately interested in understanding themselves. People take that stuff, right? It is a popular topic. But we're going to use that to talk about, what's the psychology of that? What's the theory behind that? There isn't one. I guess it's probably typology theory, but it will help make sense of the real instruments that you'll take. But we'll take that one for fun. It's just to set up the idea of like, was it accurate? What you think? Do you really believe it? Does that really say that about you?